Hi, everyone. Tonight I wanted to talk about Paradise Lost. And tonight I'll just focus on book one. So I wanted to focus on Paradise Lost and yoga, much like the dramas of Shakespeare. I think Paradise Lost can be seen from the perspective of yoga. So again, when I say yoga, I mean meditative yoga, where through the practice of techniques, scientific techniques, you raise your consciousness from ego consciousness to soul or God consciousness. You become self-realized. So some of my interpretations are going to be taken from Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. Again, that's Autobiography of a Yogi. And I highly recommend reading that book. It is one of the greatest spiritual books ever written, in my opinion. So Milton. So kind of how I'll break this talk down is kind of I'll describe the fallen state. So this is really the fall from from soul consciousness down to ego consciousness, and then talk about some of the dynamics of yoga, if I can term it that way. So Milton begins Paradise Lost with, he talks of man's first disobedience, and throughout the entirety of Paradise Lost, he says he wants to justify the ways of God to men. Okay, so Milton says he wants to talk of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Okay, so man's first disobedience, and this is taken from Genesis. Milton is obviously taking this from Genesis, is man eats of the fruit of the tree, the fruit of the forbidden tree. And again, my interpretations of Genesis are taken from Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. So the forbidden tree is the human body. Okay? And within the human body are impulses. And so what God is stating to, and Adam and Eve are symbolic of early humans, or the first humans on earth. It is stated that to Adam and Eve, i.e. the first humans, do not taste of the forbidden tree. So this is taste of impulses, of desires of the human body. So refrain from indulging in them. So whose mortal taste? So mortal taste means they began to indulge in them. The original human beings began to taste human impulses of the human body. That brought death into the world. So consciousness, coming from a state of soul or God consciousness, through their indulgence in human impulses, began to become mortal, began to become identified with the human body, which was meant to be a receptacle just to experience the earth as an entertainment. But man, over time, began to indulge in human impulses, human desires, and soul consciousness began to degrade and become ego consciousness. So this brought death into the world. So death meaning not only the passing of the mortal form, but also death of spiritual consciousness. And brought all our woe. So in ego consciousness, we have to experience suffering. So suffering physically, mentally, and spiritually. With loss of Eden is loss of that spiritual state, loss of our consciousness identifying with our soul and with God rather than ego. So it is the loss of a blissful state. Till one greater man restores. So this is reference to Christ, that Christ comes back to restore virtue and a path towards God again. This can also be said of Krishna. This can also be said of Buddha and other great prophets and avatars of God. And regain the blissful seat. So to become anchored in, to sit in a state of bliss, a state of love. Okay. Later on, Milton says, transgress his will for one restraint. Meaning that, again, human beings tasted of the body, where God said, please do not taste of that tree. And again, in Genesis, it says, you will be, the serpent said, and the serpent is Satan, but what that is, it is the voice of the Kundalini residing at the base of the spine. But again, Milton, transgress his will for one restraint. Milton is referencing again that we as human beings began to transgress against our God consciousness within us. That instead of indulging in spiritual things, we indulged in earthly things, earthly appetites. Okay, so again, this is a descent. This is a descent from soul consciousness down to ego consciousness. And soul consciousness is what ties us to God. It's what makes us aware of God. Okay, Milton later asked the question, who first seduced them to that foul revolt, human beings, to transgress that law of not tasting the tree? The infernal spirit. He it was whose guile stirred up with envy and revenge. So this is Satan, the character, is stirred up with envy and revenge. Envy and revenge in the biblical context, because God is creating human beings. And the story goes that Satan did not want to serve or bow down to humankind. Deceived the mother of mankind. So the infernal spirit, he it was whose guile, stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind, Eve. So now here's where I'm going to take an interpretation from Paramahansa Yogananda in his autobiography of a yogi. So what Eve is our feeling nature. So what happened is impulses of the human body began to overwhelm our feeling nature. Once impulses overwhelm our feeling nature, it overwhelms our reasoning nature, or Adam. So that is the story of Eve first eating of the apple and then giving it to Adam. It is the snake, and the snake again it's an image of the Kundalini, and this has been written in many Eastern scriptures, that the snake is the Kundalini, which is coiled up at the base of the spine in ego consciousness. But when raised, it does awaken us spiritually. So again, the Kundalini, when it is in the base of the spine, our consciousness in our lower chakras, and these are the three chakras, three lowest chakras, we are really identified with drives and instincts and wants and desires. so that those wants, those desires, those impulses overcome our feeling, overcome what we feel, and then it overcomes what we think. We begin to indulge in them unthinkingly. We don't weigh the consequences of indulging in those impulses. Okay. Milton is describing hell, what it's like for Satan to be in hell. And he says Satan and his cohorts, his fellow demons and pagan gods, will dwell there in adamantine chains and penal fire. So adamantine chains mean chains that can't be broken. So what this is, again, this is repeated indulgence in impulses, in desires that create habit. And once a habit is created, it's hard to break that habit. So it's hard to break from those chains of habit. And penal fire, penal meaning prison. So the impulses burn us. They create a desire to act upon them, to do something about them, to gratify them, to gratify them, to put them out. So penal fire, so fire that puts us into prison. So impulses, desires that put us in prison. That puts our soul consciousness in prison, and ego consciousness. Okay, his pride had cast him out of heaven, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, he raised impious war. So this is Satan. But again, when we indulge in our impulses and all things earthly, a war, and for most of us, an unknown war is set up to fight against those impulses. One who engages in earthly impulses thinks, well, I'm human, that's what I should do, to engage in these impulses. And that wars against our true natural state, which is a spiritual state. So it wars against our spiritual state. And I talked about this in Macbeth. Again, Milton describes Satan and his cohorts in hell, that they'll be rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal. So the soul is immortal, but when it begins to identify with the body and identify with the ego, it's confused. Really what to do. It's confused about life. What I mean by what to do, it's confused about, I guess, how to live. What is life about? What should I do? Consciousness is in a state of confusion. There is no direction. There is no path. Okay, so rolling in the fiery gulf, though, which confounds, again, passions, impulses, confounds the soul consciousness, which is immortal. It brings it down and makes it confused. Again, Milton is describing hell. Yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible. So those flames, those impulses, those earthly impulses, those desires create in us ignorance. Again, darkness, a state of confusion. We don't know what to do with life. We don't know who or what we are. This is the darkness visible. This is ignorance in all of us, based upon repeated indulgence in either negative or limited thinking, or indulging in earthly appetites. Again, Milton describes hell, where peace and rest can never dwell, with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. So again, once afflicted by or yielding to impulses and desires repeatedly, you will never know rest. You will constantly want to gratify those desires. So you are on a wheel of fire. You constantly need to gratify or want to gratify those desires. with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. So again, once you indulge in desire, in earthly desires, they're insatiable. You'll want to indulge in them again and again and again forever. In some way, they are immortal as well, because there is no end to them until death. But again, then you'll have to reincarnate and try to overcome them again in a new life. I believe Milton is talking about he's talking about certain cultures that have bowed down to pagan gods. So he talks about bowing down to bestial gods. So again, bestial gods, bowing down to bestial gods is succumbing to, giving into, yielding to earthly impulses and desires, earthly wants. And there are other references that Milton uses to kind of describe that Satan and his cohorts are in hell, but allegorically speaking, it can be there are references to false gods and idols, floods, and tempestuous fire. So I'm saying there are other references to this dynamic of being lost to impulse, to earthly desire, earthly wants, which then shuts out soul consciousness or ego consciousness, divorces you from heaven, puts you in hell. Again, hell being divorced from soul or God consciousness. So in book 1, Satan's right-hand man Beelzebub says of Satan, how changed from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, did outshine myriads. Outshine myriads meaning outshine other angels. So again, how changed from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness. This is soul. This is our consciousness identified with soul. Light, we are clothed in light, and soul, we are clothed in light, and we are clothed in happiness or bliss. But once, again, he says, how changed from. So once they're in hell, he is in darkness, he is in gloom, he is in confusion. So again, consciousness changes from a heavenly state down to a hellish state. Into what I believe one of the characters talks about hell again. Into what pit thou seest from what height fallen. Again, reference to consciousness being being identified with soul, being identified with God, being identified with spirit, and then being identified with ego, and with everything that ego is susceptible to. All the afflictions, all the physical, mental, and spiritual afflictions that ego is susceptible to, that soul is not. Okay, so now some hints at yoga here that I saw in book 1 of Paradise Lost. Some of it I am going to take out of its context. Again, I believe great writers have messages that we should take out of context. So, for example, Milton talks through Satan about the unconquerable will. Beelzebub, I think, talks about this. The unconquerable will, courage never to submit or yield. So in context, they're talking about God cannot take that. He cannot take my will. He cannot take my courage to submit or yield to him. So Beelzebub is encouraging or trying to persuade Satan to go to war against God again. Okay, but out of context, again, the unconquerable will, encourage never to submit or yield. So in yoga, this is the will to not submit, to yield, not to submit or yield to impulses. It is the courage to fight them. This is a lot about what the Bhagavad Gita is about, okay, and what Arjuna represents, the will to fight earthly impulses, earthly thoughts, earthly impulses. So speaking of thought, Satan says the mind and spirit remains invincible. So through yoga, the mind and the spirit can become invincible or immune to earthly impulses, earthly desires. As consciousness raises, goes up the spine and into the cerebrum, consciousness is no longer afflicted the way it is in ego consciousness when the kundalini is in the 3 lower chakras. Okay, so the mind and spirit can become invincible to them, or not afflicted by, or defeated by, or destroyed by earthly impulses. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. So again, the mind can choose which way to go, but I think what this references also is right attitude, positive attitude, right attitude. That no matter what you're going through, do not identify perhaps with what you're going through, but maintain a positive attitude of what you're going through. Doing this helps not to be overwhelmed by what you're going through, but it also helps to raise your consciousness. So again, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. So again, it is our mindset, it is our attitude, it is our thinking that can change us. The most famous line, perhaps, in all of Paradise Lost, Satan says it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So really, I should have talked about this in the fallen state, but really what this is saying is there's nothing above ego. The ego is the ruler. The ego, all things should serve the ego. So whatever the ego wants, the ego gets. So this is definitely the mindset of an immature ego, or just consciousness completely identified with ego. Okay. So that's actually part of the fallen state. All right. Later on, I believe it was Satan. He's speaking to his fellow demons and pagan gods. He says, "Awake, arise, or be forever fallen." So in context, he's asking them to awake, arise, let's go fight God again, or forever remain in hell. But from the yoga standpoint, to awake, to arise, to awaken, to rise, to raise the kundalini means to become awakened. Okay, you eventually reach the Christ state, the Krishna state, the Buddha state. Well, the Buddha state means the awakened state. He was referred to as the awakened one. So to arise or forever be fallen, if you do not practice meditative yoga, if you do not have a sense to serve others, then your kundalini will remain in the ego state, and it will forever be fallen. You will never raise up to the soul state, to get to the God consciousness state. Okay, again, in context, so Milton describes the demons, they were once beheld in bliss. So again, Satan is addressing them, let's go fight God again. Even though they were once beheld in bliss. So again, we were all egos at one point or time were in a blissful state, in a soul consciousness, God consciousness state at one time. Every ego, every one of us who has a body, eventually succumbed to some sort of earthly desire and became identified with it or wanted to gratify it. So once beheld in bliss, these were the demons in heaven. So they were once in heaven, they were once in bliss, but they're now in hell. And even though they were once beheld in bliss, and even though they lost it, they still want to assist Satan in fighting God. So again, this would be the ego trying to gratify desires, certain things within our consciousness that want to gratify desire at the expense of bliss. So to rather experience pleasure rather than bliss. Okay. Milton also describes that the demons' attention, that their attention held them mute. So they were paying attention to Satan, but attention held them mute. So attention is, of course, what we focus on. What do we focus on? Do we focus on our appetites and our desires and gratifying them, finding means and ways to gratify them? Or do we go inside and try to focus on our soul and our positive qualities? Or if you know a technique of meditation, do you practice those techniques? So where do you put your attention? If you put your attention on meditation, on positive virtues, on soul, on God, and I think in the beginning we all need a representation of God. So whether that's Christ, Krishna, Buddha, or a great prophet, Prophet Muhammad, Prophet Moses, if internally trying to focus on them or their qualities internally, or giving into or putting our attention on, so putting attention on them or a meditative technique, or putting our attention on earthly desires, earthly wants, and focusing our attention on how to gratify those. Okay, so attention, so I don't think I explained it fully. So once your attention goes in, then and this is through repeated practice over years of practice. And I'm not saying I'm not at that state yet, but essentially, over time, impulses, desires, negative thoughts, they're all quieted, they're all muted. So if you put your attention on gratifying, they remain loud, they have a strong voice. If you practice meditation, if you practice slowing down, if you practice overcoming impulse, they eventually become quiet or mute. Excuse me. Towards the end of book 1, pandemonium is built, the place where they will counsel on what to do about God and human beings. Milton says, the airy crowd swarmed and were straitened. So airy, again, referring to spirit, swarmed, went to, resided in, and were straightened. So this is the spine. Again, so the straightened path of the spine, through meditation and through meditation techniques, the Kundalini is raised. It is straightened. It is no longer following bypaths of gratifying various desires or listening to various thoughts. It is straightened, it's focused, and there is a goal to be reached. Okay. So those are some of the out of context clues, I'll say, that point to yoga in book 1 of Paradise Lost. So again, that there is a fallen state. So book 1 can be seen as an allegory of really the fallen state of consciousness. So from soul consciousness, God consciousness, a state of heavenly consciousness, down to ego consciousness. And the soul in ego consciousness is afflicted constantly. So with the dualities of nature, with various appetites, desires, passions. So ego is in a prison, is in hell. So those are some of my thoughts on Paradise Lost, Book 1, and Yoga, the fallen state of consciousness in hell, and then some of the things that could be done to get one out of hell, through, and especially through meditative yoga. Please comment below what are your thoughts on Paradise Lost, and please like and subscribe if you like the content. All right, thank you for listening. Bye.